Today we're going to have an adventure because we're going to discover the shroud in a way that it hadn't been discovered for hundreds of years until the end of the 19th century, when all of a sudden a revelation occurred. And the topic of our talk today is science encounters the shroud. And quite frankly, if you had asked a scientist in the middle of the 19th century what the Shroud of Turin was, the average scientist would say, what? They had never heard of it. In fact, probably only very religious people were particularly aware of it, because it was only displayed occasionally, perhaps 4 times a century, not very often. And of course, there would be some publicity and pilgrims would come, but by and large, it was not an object of a lot of popular attention. So we're going to look at some interesting things today. We talked last time a little bit about some of the characteristic markings that were on the shroud. You find on the shroud the image of a crucified man, quite a mysterious image actually, and a huge number of blood stains that correspond, interestingly enough, to the account, the passion accounts in the Gospels about Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. There's a flow of blood coming from the wrists. There is a large wound on the right chest. It looks like it's on the left when you look at the shroud, but you have to remember that the shroud is like a mirror image because it was a contact image. And when it came around, it looks like it's on the left, but it's actually the right chest of the man. A large amount of blood and serum that flowed and separated along the back. And we'll take a quick look at these just sort of by way of review of what we covered last week. And then there are small doublet blood markings along the back, the calves, the chest, all over the body, which appear to be characteristic of a vicious and extended scourging. So here's a quick summary of what we saw last week. Let me try to point a few things out. The crown of thorns is more like a cap of thorns, and it produces a lot of blood on the head, the back of the head. Also, there's blood that flows in the front of the head. The doctors that have examined the wounds on the wrist, this is the wrist wound. I wish this projector was a little brighter, but there's not much I seem to be able to do about it. Those wounds indicate that the blood flowed from the wrist, and that immediately caused people to say, what's that about? I mean, wasn't Christ nailed through the hands? And a guy named Pierre Barbet, who was a forensic medical person in France, did a study, and he concluded that it was impossible to suspend a man from nails through the hands because there's no structure, and they tear through within minutes, 10, 15 minutes, and they're torn through. So then the question became, well, where was the wound? Turns out the word for hand that's used to translate from the Greek actually isn't as specific as like the palm of our hand. It's the heart, the forepart of the arm. So it includes the hand and the wrist and a number of things. So it's just been an artist's interpretation. Artists who, by the way, never witnessed a real crucifixion. Crucifixion in art did not begin until about the 5th or 6th century, long after crucifixion had been outlawed by the Roman Empire. So the doctors who looked at this concluded, Pierre Barbet, for instance, concluded that the nail had been put through the space of Destow, which is a somewhat opening between the bones in the wrist. And there's a couple of places the nail could have gone through. And they talk about that, and the doctors actually have a little controversy about just exactly where the nail might have gone. There are at least 3 locations the space of Destow, which was Pierre Barbet's favorite location, a space that a guy named Fred Zugaby, who was a forensic doctor, he thought that the nail had gone in to the base of the palm diagonally and exited through a place which would give it the structure it needed, and that the Romans would have known that. He called that space the Z space, probably because his last name was Zugaby. And then there were the other guys who, I can't remember the name right now, who thought maybe that was back a little further between where the radius and the ulna are fused. Whatever it is, it wasn't through the palm. And then we have the Roman flagrum, which consisted of several straps with small metal balls on the end, which were used to scourge people, sometimes very viciously. Some of you may have seen Mel Gibson's motion picture, The Passion of the Christ. That picture wasn't quite fair relative to the scourging. They showed Christ being scourged with what was more like a cat of nine tails, which is actually worse than the flagrum. The flagrum was intended not to inflict pain and not so much to kill anybody, whereas the cat of nine tails, used as it was in the movie, would very likely produce death if it was extended. These wounds, these little doublet wounds, are all over the back. Finally, there's a rather large wound in the right chest. Of course, again, I said it because it's a mirror image. You see it on the left here, because this is a positive of what the shroud actually looks like physically. It's actually on the right side, however, because when you put it up against you and came it back, it would look like it's on the left side, because a contact image transferring the blood would appear like a mirror image. And finally, we have, coming from this wound, which is consistent with the kind of spear, a short spear that the Romans used, the blood flowed, the spear would have entered between the 5th and the 6th ribs at about this level, and then the blood flowed down the body, but it separated into blood and serum as it was laid out on the, as the man was laid out in the tomb. Additional blood flowed from the wound and went across the back, separating out into blood and serum. And this is rather consistent to what John the Evangelist said when he described the wound as exhibiting both blood and water, because the serum looks very much like water. It's a little yellower. And there's blood in the feet that runs down, lying on the man lying on his back on the shroud. The blood that flowed down the foot, exited the heel, and dribbled off to the side. Okay, that's kind of what we talked about last time in a quick summary fashion. You'll have to excuse me for sitting down, but my feet are none too good anymore. I'm slowly entering that degradation phase that they call old age. Despite telling everybody I'm really only 12 years old. I've been 12 for 6 times now, 6 times now, so it cycles. Today we're going to focus on science. Part of the reason for that is, frankly, you wouldn't be here had it not been for the science. You would probably never have heard of the Shroud of Turin. The science has been staggeringly successful in terms of getting people interested in the Shroud. We have a large cabal of people who believe it's authentic. Some of those are accused of being true believers, as though there's something wrong with that. Excuse me. There's another bunch on the other side who are sort of true dissidents, who will be skeptical I mean, if Christ got up off the shroud and walked up and said hello to them, they would probably say, "You're a mirage," or "I must have had too much marijuana this morning." So whatever it is. And then in the middle, there are people that are kind of like me. I'm one of those people who is a scientist. My background is in science, and I'm kind of a show me kind of guy. I want to know, what is this thing? I call this an enduring mystery because after hundreds of thousands of hours of research by hundreds of scientists, nobody can tell me how an image got on this cloth. What's more, when you see all of the characteristics of the image, I think you'll understand how difficult a problem it is. Now, there are many other perspectives on the Shroud of Turin, and we'll touch on some of those as we continue the course. Next week we're going to be talking about history, but today we're looking at science. And science discovered the Shroud on a very specific date and time. The Shroud was being exhibited on the occasion of a royal wedding. The Shroud was owned at this time and had been owned for a very long time, since the 15th century, by the House of Savoy, which was the house of the King of Italy. And there was in fact, the king who died in, I think, 83 or thereabouts, was in fact getting married in 1898. That can't be right. 1898 to 1989. He'd be an awful old king, wouldn't he? We'll have to check that one. But anyway, there was a royal wedding going on, and for the first time, photography was still young. For the first time, a photographer was asked to take a picture of the Shroud. You have to understand a little bit how difficult that was, because remember, this is 1898. Electrical lighting isn't around much. I mean, to get electric lighting, they had arc lamps. Any of you ever seen an arc lamp? Arc lamps they put electricity on both poles of two large carbon rods, and they bring the carbon rods close together until they start arcing, and that creates light. It also creates sputtering and nasty stuff, and that's all they had to light. The Shroud itself was behind glass. It was inside a cathedral. Secunda Pia was not a professional photographer. There were no such thing, basically, as professional photographers. There were only people who were very, very accomplished hobbyists, because this is the kind of camera you had. Secunda Pia's camera was like 2 feet, a 2-foot cube wooden box, and you had to make your own film. You did this by getting a glass plate, and in a dark room you would coat the plate with light-sensitive chemicals, let it dry, put it in a carrier that was completely light-tight, and then take it to your box, where you would slide the carrier into the box and then pull the carrier out, leaving the glass plate behind. You would then manually open the lens and with a watch make your exposure for 5 or 6 minutes. Because film, this wasn't film. Actually, I was reminded the other day that very shortly there will be people who don't know what film is, because nobody's camera now works with film. So, and the result is they won't know what a negative is. So I may have to change my presentation on the Shroud. So this all happened on May 28, 1898. Secunda Pia, who was a lawyer in regular life, was permitted to take a picture of the Shroud, and he took his plates back to his darkroom. And in the darkroom, as the plate emerged from the developer, this is what he saw. Now, nobody had envisioned anything like this. He realized, in fact, the stories goes that he almost dropped the plate. And of course, had he dropped the plate, he would have to go back and take another picture because that would have shattered that one. Nobody had envisioned that the shroud itself behaved like a negative, so that when you took a picture and developed it, the picture was a positive. Now, it's not a perfect positive. I mean, the man in the shroud probably didn't have white or grayish hair. This was black and white film, but it's clearly a better picture than that. So you can imagine that Secundo Pio was pretty amazed. And so was everyone else. It produced a total sensation. In fact, it produced such a sensation that it attracted the attention of scientists. A group of scientists at the Sorbonne in Paris, and you have to forgive my French pronunciation. I'm a good German and don't speak French very well. So there are a few words in French that come along, like Yves Delage. This was a very prominent biologist in the Sorbonne, and a member of the French Academy of Scientists, and he had an international reputation. He was encouraged by these pictures to study this phenomenon. How is it that an image got on a linen cloth that was a negative? And he got a young instructor of science named Paul Vignon involved, and he and a group of associates took up the study of the Shroud of Turin, and they studied it for about 3 years. So for 3 years, Paul Vignon and his associates studied the shroud, and they did all kinds of things. They did experiments. They tried to create images. They took human beings and coated them with paint and pressed cloths on them, and they couldn't get anything that looked the least bit like the shroud. And they concluded that the impression on the Holy Shroud are produced by chemical action. Why chemical action? Well, the problem was the image exists in places where the cloth clearly wasn't touching the body. So it can't be entirely a contact image. It has to have some action at a distance. And when you think about it, how many action at a distance phenomena can you think of? Well, Paul Vignon thought that maybe this is a man who had been tortured, he had sweated a great deal, he had bled a great deal. He may have been washed in the tomb before he was laid on the shroud, and so there would be moisture, and the moisture would carry chemically reactive materials up and down from the body, falling from the body and rising if there was any kind of draft, up to contact the cloth and possibly induce a stain. That was the only thing he could come up with. They presented their findings in 1902. Delage presented the findings to the French Academy of Sciences, and they concluded that the shroud was not a painting. Now, regardless of historical documents that say it is, there was such a historical document, and we'll talk a lot about that next time because it's a fascinating document, and it is one of those many little fascinating side trails that the shroud has involved in it, because it tells us as much about political intrigue as it does about the shroud itself. It's a negative, the reason it's not a painting is there isn't any pigment. It's a negative image. Well, we can see that with Secundo Pio's picture, but the fidelity is beyond the ability of Renaissance artists. You have to understand that art at the time that we know the shroud existed in Europe had still not developed an understanding of perspective, vanishing points, or any of the modern things that we normally associate with art. The the techniques of art simply weren't up to the level of imagery of the Shroud. There's no signs of artistic preparation. That means the cloth wasn't sized. The cloth looks like untouched linen almost everywhere, except mainly in the bloodstain areas. So they concluded that the image is an imprint of a human corpse produced by the action of some natural forces they didn't really understand, but they presented a theory, and their physical theory of image formation was called the vaporograph theory. And that'll come back to bite us a little bit more a little later in the talk, because there aren't very many theories that make any sense out of the image of the Shroud. So here's how the vaporograph theory works. Febrile sweat covering the unwashed body contains urea, which changes to ammonia and releases ammoniac vapor. This ammonia, which is in relatively low concentration, comes up and interacts with a mixture of spices that included aloes on the body and produce staining vapors that produce stains on the cloth. Because the vapors rise vertically in the humid air trapped between the body and the Shroud, you maintain a reasonable degree of resolution, and the stain is graduated on the receptive surface this is Vignon, according to the contours of the body. Now, Vignon couldn't really do the whole experimental deal, but he took a shot at it, and I'll probably show you those the week after next. You can look them up. He wrote a book called, I think, The Shroud of Turin, a very original title, which can be found. It was published in 1902. It's a little bit out of date, but it is available on the internet, and primarily, actually, they have recently printed copies of it. You can also get original copies when the English translation, and from these bookstores that'll sell it to you for a penny and $4 shipping, because there appears not to be much demand for the first book. The second book I can't seem to get. I've been trying to get his second book, which was printed around 1938, and I saw one, and it was $130 they wanted for it. And I gulped and said, well, I don't think so. I don't want it that much. I mean, it is out of date after all. Then I told my wife, and she said, well, you should have bought it. She's always helpful that way. So I went back and I looked, and it had already been sold. So it was the only one out there. So if anybody sees that one, I'm now permitted to spend $130 on it if it shows up again. Now, Vignon in that book, the 1938 book, and the reason I would like to have a copy of it, presented a theory that he developed when he was trying to understand if the Shroud was authentic, then wouldn't there be some sign in history that the image on the Shroud had impacted Christian art, for example? And interestingly enough, he found that up until about the 5th century, there were very few representations of Christ. In fact, I think there's only one that I'm aware of, in which Christ is shown with a beard. Almost all the impressions of Christ, all the paintings of Christ up till around the 5th century, show Christ as a young man, beardless. There's pictures of Christ as the Good Shepherd, a young beardless boy almost modeled on David, who was a shepherd after all, with a shepherd around his neck. And then all of a sudden, these kind of pictures started showing up. This is an early one. These are called the Pancreator pictures. And these all show Christ looking straight out, large eyes. They almost all have a neckline. Most of them have a little U-shaped box between the eyes. Many of them have a little V shape. Both of these are images that are on the shroud. And in all, Vignon collected 15 indicators, which he called markings, the Vignon markings, which he considered indicators that this art had influenced the shroud. Now you could obviously argue back the other way and say, well, maybe somebody faking the shroud looked at the art and collected a bunch of marks and put them on the shroud. I mean, that's the trouble with those kind of arguments. It's kind of like, does CO2 increase warming, or does warming increase CO2? You need to get more data. But these are 15 different characteristic markings which Vignon felt rather compellingly demonstrated that the shroud had had an influence on art. We have to ask the question, well, why the 5th century? Why that particular time frame? And we'll look at that next week. Now, in the meantime, Secundapia was accused of fraud. He was accused of all kinds of manipulation of the photographs in the darkroom to make this image come out this way. He was basically vilified and attacked. Luckily, there was another wedding. This is probably the right, yeah, this is the wedding on Umberto. He's the guy that gave the shroud finally to the Pope in 1983. Umberto, the Crown Prince of Italy, was marrying Princess Maria Jose of Belgium in 1931. And they decided, because Secundapia's picture had been so controversial and generated so much interest in the shroud, I don't think anybody was interested in any science at this point, but they were kind of interested in clearing Secundapia's name. They were also interested in the tremendous amount of interest in the shroud that these pictures had created, which produced literally millions of people coming to Turin to see it. And in 1931, they got Giuseppe Henri, who was a professional photographer, to take new pictures of the shroud. And he took 12 photographs. His technology was tremendously improved over the intervening 33 years. And the result was astounding photographs. Photographs that completely exonerated Secundapia and were far better than Secundapia's photographs had been. And they showed, and these are the photographs that I first saw, only I saw them projected using glass slides and a glass lantern slide projection, which this doesn't begin to give you the full appreciation of how detailed these images were. They were spectacular, just beyond, really beyond belief. And that a young boy, let's see, how old was I? I was 20. I guess I wasn't that young a boy, but I was 20 in 1962 when I first saw this. And I was blown away by these pictures. And they actually stimulated in me a lifetime interest in the Shroud of Turin. These are, of course, the negatives. These would have called, I would tend to call these Henri 31. And over here we have, the pictures we have here are Schwartz 78. Now, there are many different pictures. Barry Schwartz took the images that I have here at the STURP investigation that was conducted in '78. So let's go on. So what more? Obviously, these pictures were so good and so impressive, and Giuseppe Henri was so renowned as a photographer that there wasn't any question anymore that there was any fraud involved. This established the fact that the shroud was something incredibly unique. No questions anymore. So but it still didn't get out to get shown to the public more than once every 20 or 30 years, that kind of thing. It was owned by the House of Savoy. But the Umberto was interested in learning more about the shroud. And a commission was formed by Cardinal Pellegrino. Cardinal Pellegrino was sort of the custodian of the shroud for the House of Savoy. It was stored in a church, even though it was owned by the King of Italy. You could only get to it with 3 keys. It was in a locked behind a high altar. It was in a box, and the king had a key, Cardinal Pellegrino had a key, and some custodian of the cathedral had a key. And if you wanted to get it out, you had to get all 3 keys. You can imagine, last time I think we mentioned the fire of 1532, and these keys things can be a real problem if something starts to happen like a fire, because you got to get all these guys together or you have to break into it. And that actually happened again in the 1990s when an arsonist tried to destroy the shroud by burning the cathedral. And some firemen, courageous Turinese firemen, took fire axes and punched their way through 2 inches of fireproof, bulletproof glass to break into the shroud, to carry the shroud out of the cathedral, because they were afraid that the fire would end up destroying it. Anyway, in '69, Cardinal Pellegrino had put together a commission to advise him on how could we do some science on the shroud. Nothing happens fast with the Shroud of Turin. Nothing. I mean, you know, I think it's because everybody seems to think that, well, we can wait. What's 25 years, 100 years, 200 years, and we'll see this come back. One of the things people wanted to do for a long time was carbon date, but the amount of material you needed to do carbon dating, which is a destructive test, in this time frame was big pieces of cloth. And we'll touch on that in a little bit later. So there were 4 years of diplomatic activity, and finally in January '73 there was approval to conduct some scientific studies on the shroud. Now these were very limited studies, but here's one of the studies was conducted on November 23rd, 1973. I should say more a data collection, where Dr. Max Frey, who was a Swiss criminologist, and Max Frey's claim to fame is that he developed the sticky tape technique for crime scene collection of things like dusts and pollens and microscopic evidence at a crime scene. And he applied this technology to the shroud, taking adhesive tape from an ordinary roll of adhesive tape, pressing it against various locations on the shroud, and then putting the tape against a glass slide to preserve it and keep it from being further manipulated. And he then subsequently discovered in the dusts of these that he collected on these tapes pollens that were specific to a wide variety of plants. And the thing that was interesting is that a number of these plants were unique to Palestine. Now understand, he did this in Turin. So he's in Turin, Italy, and he finds on the shroud pollens from Palestine, pollens from the Anatolian steppes, which is a location north of Jerusalem, not sure how many miles. It's northeast of Antioch, and it's in modern day terms, it's Urfa in Turkey, in southern Turkey. He found pollens that were unique to that location. He also found a very few pollens that were unique to Constantinople. And then there were a few pollens that were European. In all, he collected something like 94 pollen, and he wasn't successful in classifying them all, because it's a very difficult thing to classify pollens, and some people are still arguing whether Frey got all the pollen classification correct. But interestingly enough, what he did get suggested that the shroud had been in Jerusalem. It had been in the Anatolian steppe area of Turkey. It had been in Constantinople, which is today is Istanbul. And of course they knew it had been in Europe. So when did this happen? Come next week and we'll talk about that. Meanwhile, so here's the pollen stuff. Here we go. Jerusalem, Edessa, here's Antioch, and here's Constantinople over here. So pollen's from here, here, and here. And this picture is of Max Fry using his tape in 1978, because he had another opportunity to do this when the scientists came in 1978. 3/4 of the species he found on the shroud grow in Palestine, and 13 of the species were characteristic of the area. 20 of the species were abundant in the Anatolian steppe, and 4 around Constantinople, which is kind of what. And I got this particular material from Emanuela Marinelli, who is an Italian shroud researcher, and she wrote a summary of Max Fry's work. Max Fry passed on before he finished publishing all his information. His data is now held by an American shroud group, and there are people that are continuing to study his samples. So we may hear more. Well, the next day, okay, Max did his work on the 23rd. On the 24th, a gentleman by the name of Gilbert Reyes took a famous sample from the shroud. And it's a sample, here's a natural light picture. The sample area is this little tiny area there. And there's a picture of the actual sample that was taken. It was a rather small sample. In addition, he took a sample of a few threads. And there's the size of the samples. 40 millimeters, that's 4 centimeters. Okay, it's less than 2 inches. By 10 millimeters, 1 centimeter. 2 samples of about that same size. One was taken from the side strip. The side strip extends all the way up the cloth from one end to the other, and it's about 3.5 inches wide, and nobody knows why there's a side strip. Trust me, this is weird. The side strip is really weird. There's at least 3 theories about the side strip. It's original. It was cut to help wind the body, and then reattached later. And I forget what the third theory is, but this is the shroud in transmitted light. It's interesting that you can see make out the sample a little bit because it transmits light. Now, right adjacent to this sample that Reyes took is where the 1988 carbon dating samples were taken. And I would like you to notice that there's some discoloration in this whole area relative to the rest of the shroud. And we don't know exactly why, but there is some suspicion that it may just because when the shroud was exhibited, all people were holding it from that edge. And that's one of the theories about it, that it was there, that there were reinforcements so that when the shroud was exhibited, it wouldn't tear. That was another side strip theory. Okay, so now in '73 we had some science, not very much, but a little bit. Now there's another fellow who got fascinated by reading a book about the shroud, a guy by the name of John Jackson. And I think I mentioned John last time. He is widely known as the Pied Piper of the shroud. And I didn't remember where I got that title, and then I reread John Heller's book. Somebody came today and showed me they had gotten a copy of John Heller's book, The Report on the Shroud of Turin. That is a great book on this very topic we're talking about today. John Heller, bless his soul, is dead, but he was an accomplished scientist. and he sucked Alan Adler, who was another accomplished scientist, into shroud work. Both of them did monumentally complete blood studies on the shroud, using samples that were taken at the 1978 science. But this is sort of the origin of that science work. John Jackson, who couldn't talk to anybody without showing them pictures of the shroud and getting excited and enthusiastic and telling them about the science he was doing on the shroud, and wouldn't they be interested in doing science on the shroud with him, and the next thing you know, he just sucked people in. And he and Eric Jumper both got posted to the Air Force Academy. He had known Eric at I think Los Alamos, because he had been previously working at either somewhere in the Albuquerque region. And the two of them basically single-handedly did a lot of shroud studies. And what do you do? How do you study a 14-foot cloth that you can't get your hands on? All you got is some photographs. Well, one of the things you can do is make one, and that's what they did. They got 14 feet of cloth, and they projected the pictures on the cloth, and they duplicate the stains on the cloth, and then they started looking for Air Force cadets who were the right size, who were willing to volunteer to lie on the cloth and let the cloth be wrapped around them to see whether that would produce something interesting. And what it did is produced, what Jumper says is, there was really only one way to correctly wrap the body in the cloth and make everything work, which was an experimental confirmation that whatever the shroud was, it was entirely consistent with having once wrapped a body, because the topography was correct. And we'll see some examples, some other examples of that. But Jumper said there's only one way to correctly wrap the body. So you had to get somebody that's the right size, wrap them up, and away you go. Now, they did some other things, and one of the things that they did that was very interesting is they discovered that the shroud's information was three-dimensional. Now I forgot that I had to be able to mouse this thing. So I'm going to go over here and mouse my display. And this is an image from the VP8 image analyzer. Whoops, oh, that didn't work. How am I going to do that? Let's see. That's pretty cool. Now, the VP8 image analyzer is just a scientific device which is used by photoanalysts to try to create contrast in images. It's mostly used for things, at least my perception is that it's mostly used to do things like look at x-rays and get contrast senses of x-rays and things of that nature. Here we demonstrated with a piece of passive technology that was not designed to do anything with the Shroud of Turin, that shroud information that Paul Vignon said was three-dimensional was three-dimensional. Very cool. And this was done about February 19th, 1976. And we now know that, son of a gun, the shroud is the shroud image is not only a negative, it's three-dimensional. It encodes cloth to body distance. So here's a couple other VP8 pictures I thought you might find interesting. So now that I've more or less figured out how to make it go, there's the whole body image. And here, this particular one is after they set the body image in a way they liked, they then rotated it. So it's pretty good three-dimensional information. There's a lot of noise in it because of the burns and because of other artifacts. In fact, one of the more interesting things is that later on, in fact, I've got an image I'll show you later on where people have tried to clean up the artifacts and show you what the three-dimensional image looks like when it's cleaned up. So what did Jackson and Jumper do? Now, I'm not entirely sure of the order of this data, because some of this data was taken before the VP8 analyzer, but one of the things they did is they used their human volunteers, they laid the cloth over the human volunteer, and they estimated the cloth to body distance on average that a human being would have relative to the cloth, and they called it a ridge line. They took data along a ridge line, and they, using a microdensitometer, they measured the intensity of the image, and they showed that the image did in fact track a reasonable looking curve that showed that when the cloth was near the body, the image was darker. When it was further away from the body, the image was lighter, and the image stopped changing. The extension point was at about 4 centimeters. So 4 centimeters is about 1.5 inches, something a little more. So about that much distance is encoded. Now what they got, I don't know how they talked the cadets into doing this. I mean, it must be some kind of pixie dust or something, or, you know, but they got hundreds of Air Force cadets to voluntarily take microdensitometer readings. They took thousands and thousands of microdensitometer readings, and they took pieces of corrugated cardboard, and they cut out a graph in lines, hundreds, thousands presumably of lines. Here's the face. This is just the face. Here's an image of the whole body of the man. So they actually manually converted densitometer readings into the three-dimensional information. So you can actually, if you go to the Air Force Academy today and go to the chapel, they have this this statue that was built by Jackson, Jumper, and the students. It's a very fascinating thing. Now, there's the VP8 image. One of the things the VP8 image didn't do is reproduce this curve. It just you kind of dialed in a slope, and so one of the things they wanted to do is try to see, well, what would the image look like if you could dial in the exact curve? Well, they didn't know exactly how to do that, but one of their technical people that was interested, a guy named D. German, who is a PhD in electrical engineering, created a diode function generator which mapped this curve, and they put they scanned the Shroud image, and this image is this curve mapped into the three-dimensional. I think this image is a little bit more realistic looking. It's not quite as flat as this one, and I think that's because they got the whole curve. Very fascinating though, and this created an internet, I mean, a truly furor. It was in all the magazines, and that's when I said, I saw this, some of my friends who knew I was a Shroud nut, you know, I got friends bringing me copies of magazines saying, did you see this, Ray? Did you see this, Ray? This is really cool. You know, and that's when I realized that, son of a gun, you could do science on the Shroud of Turin. I'd never thought about it that way. I mean, I'd seen the glass slides. I knew you could take photographs. I knew it was three-dimensional. That's really cool. But science? Let me show you. This image here is a little movie that I took at the 2008 Columbus Shroud Conference when Petrus Soons, by the way, this is Petrus Soons, and this guy is Pete Schumacher. Schumacher is one of the guys involved in the VPA. So these two guys are really into three-dimensional shroud images. Let me show you my movie. Now you might hear some noise too, because I never did figure out how to turn that off. But because this is a video I took at the conference. It's a very short video. You can hear people talking in the background. Now there's some missing image. There's places where the image isn't present. And they didn't fill anything in to...
Creative license there. They remap what?
Okay, it wasn't a very long movie, but you got to admit the 3D was pretty cool. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have my camera readily available when I later discovered that Petter Soons had 3D rotating things of the front, the whole body, and the back as well. And you can find his stuff online, including animations. And just remember, just remember the name Petrus Soons. That shouldn't be too hard. And you can get a chance to see the kinds of things he's done. I hope he advances this work further. I think it's fascinating work. One of the things I'm very interested in doing is scanning the shroud image and filtering out all the things that are not image. And then with the remainder, trying to apply 3D studies. But I'm kind of lazy, and I don't know when I'll get to that. There's also appeared to be button-like things on the eyes, and that made some people speculate that perhaps there were coins on the eyes. And I'm not going to go into that a whole bunch. You can check that out on the internet. I am not a fan of speculative things. I think it's very difficult to say with any certainty that there are coins on the eyes. I would not completely rule it out, but I'm not sure the evidence is compelling. Now, all of this stuff was so significant to people. I mean, it was producing all kinds of publicity that the people at the Holy Shroud Guild and the people even in Europe kind of started noticing that something was going on. And they ran a conference in 1977 in Albuquerque and produced a conference proceedings. Now, when I say they ran a conference, this was a conference on the cheap. People went to this conference and ran the conference. There was no support. A little bit of support from the Holy Shroud Guild. Peter Rinaldi and Adam Otterbein came. Interestingly enough, a whole bunch of the people that ended up working on the Shroud Science Group were at this conference because it was mostly about work that they had done. So they put on this conference, and somebody put up the money. Somebody donated the money to make a proceedings, and they I don't remember how many the proceedings they printed. That's actually the first scientific document I ever got on the Shroud of Turin, because I had written an article about the Shroud for a little local parish kind of newspaper function kind of thing, because I was interested in the Shroud. And I sent a copy to the Holy Shroud Guild just on a lark. And I got Father Adam Otterbein got a hold of me. He must have motivated an awful lot of people. And he sent me a copy of the proceedings. Later, they took these proceedings to Turin, and they were so interested in the proceedings in Turin that it was the kickoff of the 1978 STURP conference. Now, they got indications from Europe that it might be possible for the American scientists to get access to the Shroud. Wow. Nothing guaranteed, you understand, but maybe Well, that was enough for John Jackson and the team. They got working on it. They didn't have any money, they didn't have any organization, they didn't have a plan, and they didn't have any equipment. And they only had 5 months. But they got cracking, and Eric Jumper suggested that since they didn't know whether they'd even be able to get in to see the Shroud, and they didn't know how much time they'd have, maybe they should do it kind of like NASA did and design a series of experiments in blocks. And so they designed experiments in 12-hour blocks, 12, 24, 36, 48, all the way to 96 hours. And they didn't even know they'd be able to get to see the Shroud. Now, Tom D. Mulhalla of the Nuclear Technology Corporation heard about these guys, and he's a kind of an entrepreneurial guy. He went to one of their meetings, and he was an organizational kind of guy, a scientist, manager, and he looked at these guys, and he saw, these are highly respected scientists from many prestigious institutions, but they didn't have a manager in the lot. And they didn't have any money, and they didn't have any organization, they didn't have a plan, and they didn't have any equipment. And de Mulhalla thought they were nuts. But then he sort of caught the infection too. He must have taught to John Jackson. And the next thing you know, he was organizing a 501c kind of tax-exempt corporation for him. He designed a table to mount the Shroud on if they got a chance to test it. He started soliciting equipment from donations from manufacturers of equipment. They organized a dry run on Labor Day weekend of '78, even though they still hadn't even got approval to go. And they arranged for a mock Shroud to be created. Remember the mock one that they rolled over the students? This was a better one. They put it all together in less than 5 months. And when you read the history, that's why John Heller's book is so interesting, because it talks about a lot of this. You have to wonder after a while whether there weren't some guardian angels or something running the show, because nothing happens this way. D. Mulhalla had a guy who worked in his finance department. He said, well, let's get a 501c. And the guy said, it takes 1 year to 2 years to do that. You can't get that. They got it in 3 months. Nobody knows why they got it in 3 months, but they got it in 3 months. So in 1978, the American scientists got an opportunity to do the only significant, huge amount of science that's ever been done on the Shroud. 1978, the STURP team shows up in Turin. They almost didn't go. Why didn't they almost go? Because the Pope had died. Pope John Paul I had died. And they weren't sure that they'd be able to see the Shroud. They didn't know what was going to be happening because the Pope had died. And they had actually been told that it might be canceled. But only John Jackson was told, and John talked to Eric Jumper about it, and they decided to keep it secret from the group. Because they'd have enough experience with these characters in Turin to know that maybe tomorrow it'd be different. So they just kept it secret because they had had so much preparation ongoing. They had $2.5 million in donated scientific equipment to make these tests. They had poured many hours of thinking into developing a scientific plan, and they were going to go to Turin, and they still didn't have approval to do any tests whatsoever on the Shroud. None. Except it was being considered. So they came to Turin. Two things happened that were really interesting. One of them was all of their equipment was seized by the Italian customs. And because one of the devices had a radioactive material in it, not very much radioactive material, it was some kind of a sensor that required a radioactive material to do some initial ionization. I don't want to get into the kind of technical stuff involved, but it wasn't significant. But because of that, it had a radiological symbol stamped on the case. And the Taiwanese customs people saw that and said, "Blah, radioactivity," and they impounded everything. And they wanted a lot of money to get it out of impounding. They wanted to prove, and they said they wouldn't be able to release it for maybe a month. One of the devices was a sensor that, in order to remain active and not destroy itself, had to be maintained at liquid nitrogen temperatures. And it was sitting in a dewar. The dewar is a container that maintains very cold temperatures, like a fancy thermos bottle, and had liquid nitrogen in it. But the liquid nitrogen is bubbling away, and you only had about 96 hours before you had to replenish the liquid nitrogen, and they didn't want to let the thing down. So the scientists are going nuts. Nobody is even sure they can see the shroud. And Peter Rinaldi, bless his soul, member of the Holy Shroud Guild, a Turinese, born, raised, an altar boy in Turin, who's always been an advocate of the Shroud of Turin. He went around and talked to the cardinal. He talked to the customs people, and he said, "You do understand that if you continue doing this, you are going to create an international incident." Then he had the cardinal called, and now the customs are getting a little concerned, and they say, "Well, we'll let it go, but you have to put a filed bond. You got to put money up." Well, nobody had any money, The Shroud team that had come had mostly hocked their houses so they could make so that they could come. So they had second mortgages on their houses so that they could pay the airfare. These are just working stiffs who were interested in the Shroud and were good scientists, but they didn't have any money. And nobody was paying anybody for this. And so Rinaldi went to the cardinal and said, "We've got this equipment, but they want a bond." And the cardinal hocked the cathedral.
Oh.
Can you believe that? The cardinal hocked the cathedral into security for the bond. The bond was filed with only about 2 days before the testing would commence, they finally released all of this equipment. This is a picture of the van. It was all piled up, and when they got there, they said, by the way, most of this is in John Heller's book, so he's probably even more interesting than I am, and I'm incredibly interesting. So, but John Heller's book pointed out that when they got there, that somebody said, "Where's the forklift?" Some of this stuff weighs hundreds and hundreds of pounds. We need a forklift. Oh, there's no forklift.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
And there's also no stevedores. So all of this equipment was lugged into the cathedral, actually the palace grounds, because the cathedral and the palace are joined. Because remember, this belonged to the king of Italy. They all carried, a bunch of scientists came out, climbed up on the truck, grabbed the cake, and carried it into the palace. And some people say they'd never seen some of these guys work so hard in their whole life, carrying all this equipment. Well, what did they do? Well, they had put together the most immense battery of tests, primarily focused on the idea that the Shroud was some kind of an exotic painting, and they were going to expose it as a fraud. It was a reasonable supposition on their part. So they came with high-resolution visible light photography, photomicroscopy, X-ray radiography, infrared reflectance, spectroscopy, ultraviolet reflect, a lot of this kind of thing. Visible narrowband and wideband photography with filters where you take multiple exposures through narrow filters in order to get spectroscopic images. Adhesives tape sampling modeled on what Max Fry had done in 1973. And optical transmission photography, which, by the way, this was not on the original plan. This actually was an idea that popped up during the testing, so we'll see this. They had carefully blocked out the tests that would be performed in hourly increments, starting at 12 hours and moving up in blocks. And again, they did not know how much time they were going to get. They had been told they would get 12 hours. So the first increment was like 12 hours. And then there was a group called the Centro that was actually trying all the time to keep the American scientists from getting a chance to work on the Shroud. That appears to be what their agenda was. They were exposed and complained about to Cardinal Palestrino not by the Americans, because that might not have worked, but by, in fact, some of the people that were pro the scientists. And the next thing you know, the Cardinal said, how much time do they need? And he gave them 120 hours, 5 days. And these guys studied the Shroud for 5 days, catching 2-hour cat naps the whole time, Charlie. And it was an amazing thing. They did photomicroscopy. This is Mark Evans. I have 32 of his, we'll see a few of his, he took, this is a shot at 6.3 magnification. This is a shot at, I think, 54. And this is a high resolution shot of an image fiber that was taken from an adhesive tape sample of an image fiber. And you'll notice how the image is, the fiber itself is pristine. It's just slightly golden. They examined the Shroud using X-ray radiography, and one of the things that they got pretty uniform responses, except in the area of the nose, the left knee, and the foot, especially the heel. And they didn't know what that was. And so somebody said the strongest response was from the heel, so they got out the microscope and they ran it over to where the heel was, and they looked at the microscope with a dissecting needle looking into and the guy that was looking at it says, it's dirt. There's dirt in between the threads that, in the weave in the region of the heel. Duh. This is a guy who walked barefoot carrying a cross. Would he have dirt on his feet? Yeah, probably. Now, interestingly enough, later on, they did spectroscopy on the dirt, specifically the dirt found on the heel, and they matched it to a rare form of travertine aragonite, which is a form of calcium carbonate, which is found in Jerusalem, near the Damascus Gate. And Dr. Riccardo Levi-Setti of the University of Chicago performed spectrums on the dirt that was found on the Shroud itself from tape samples, and samples that were sent to him from Jerusalem. And they matched. So it appears, this form is apparently quite rare. I'm not an expert on this, so I'm taking their word for it, but it's apparently a rare form. It is found in Jerusalem. It probably is found in some other areas of the world, but not, it's well known in Jerusalem, and it matched. So we've got dirt on the heel of the man of the Shroud that can't be seen except under a microscope, or at least some very close inspection in between the threads, that comes from Jerusalem. Very interesting, as my wife likes to say. All right, Max Fry is back. He got invited to participate and take samples. This is Ray Rogers, who is a Los Alamos chemist. And Ray was not particularly happy with Max Fry's technique. On the other hand, Max Fry's technique, which was rubbing, pushing with a lot of finger pressure into the tape, was very good at picking up a lot of debris. The STURP people were concerned. They had been told they mustn't disturb the shroud, nothing invasive. So they had made a special tape applicator which could be dialed into how much pressure it applied. They also came with a special tape that had been made by 3M not to leave any kind of residue, whereas ordinary tape leaves a residue. So they took, Fry got 25 additional samples in non-image areas. He also got into a little bit of a contest with John Jackson when he was seen to kind of start towards the image of the face with his thumb and his tape, and John Jackson said, "Whoa, don't go sticking tape on the face." And there was a confrontation, and it was decided that Jackson was right. They shouldn't be sticking tape on the face. So they got a lot of tape samples, and these samples were extraordinarily important. Another thing they got is Righi, who is an Italian scientist, got permission. This is when the Centro was trying to say, well, we've got to do something. If the Americans are doing something, we have to do something. And they got him to come up with a protocol. And he came up with a really nice protocol in very little time, in which he made a special vacuum cleaner. They separated the backing cloth, and he actually took vacuum samples of dust from behind the shroud, in between the shroud and the backing cloth that had been on the shroud for hundreds of years. And he collected the dust that was back there. And they also had one of these fiber optic kind of scopes that could go in and take pictures. And this is the first picture from outside of the, this is the blood stain on the forehead of the man of the shroud, illuminated from behind. And the Americans saw that and they said, yes, we have got to take a picture of transmitted light through the Shroud of Turin. They hadn't thought about that, but that would tell you a lot about the density of the image, so they did. This was a pickup test that hadn't been planned, but they did this rather comprehensively. I've got a bunch of images of this. A couple of things I want to point out to you. The first one is you can't see the image anymore. Okay, yeah, there's some blood. The blood stands out. There's blood here, by the way. You can still see the water stains. There's a water stain up in the chest region somewhere. Another thing that's really interesting that you can see are these discolorations that are horizontal, that are sort of irregularly spaced along the shroud. What is that about? Now, this is an example of one of the thing I call banding. There are a number of banding phenomena associated with the shroud. This particular banding, and it's up here again, you can see there, this particular banding led John Jackson, in conjunction with some historical information, to build a very interesting device, which we'll just call the Constantinople device. And we'll talk about that. I don't think I have a slide about that. Now here's another slide about banding. It's one of the things that's interesting is that the image shows sort of a blank. The image goes bing, 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 bong. The image sort of stops imaging. What's that about? Now a lot of people would say, well, there was a chest, a face cloth that was bound around the jaw, and that's why there's no image alongside the face. And a lot of people wrote about that, and it's not true. Why do I know it's not true? Well, I went up to a meeting in Esophagus, and at Esophagus they had Vern Miller, who was the chief scientific photographer at the 1978 image. He had taken these very, very large negative images of the shroud. He made a transparency, and they had a full-size transparency. And I went up to that transparency and I looked, and this line here follows a single thread. There is no way that a face band is going to produce a sudden termination of the imaging mechanism along a single thread. And that's another piece of the banding information. Now, the interesting thing about this banding phenomena is that there's image information in there. It's just attenuated. It's weaker. And when Petrus Soons made his three-dimensional one of the things he did is he adjusted the sensitivity, and he brought out some of the image data that's actually in there. And this suggests a couple of things. One of the things it suggests is whatever the image phenomena is, it's yarn lot dependent. Because these are warp threads and weft threads. The image is largely along the warp threads, and all of a sudden it disappears. Now what happened is, here's the adjusted image where they've changed the sensitivity, and it broadens the face and makes it look a little bit more realistic, because this is an awfully narrow-faced guy with this banding phenomenon. So that's interesting. What about the blood work? Well, here's Al Adler again. I mentioned Al last time. He's the porphyrin chemist who has a porphyrin ring always on his t-shirt, and he opens it up like Superman and says, I'm Al Adler. I'm a porphyrin chemist. I love that, you know, and he always did that kind of stuff, you know. He was a great guy. Here's a porphyrin ring. And that's part of the structure of blood. The interesting thing about a porphyrin ring is you can do spectroscopic data on it, and it actually is part of the reason that blood is red, because this creates a sensitivity to red light. It causes it to reflect red light. So he's an expert in porphyrins, and he was sucked into this Shroud stuff by John Heller, who is the author of the book, The Report on the Shroud of Turin. And one of the things he brought to the table was the demonstration that if it's blood, it should fluoresce at the frequency of the porphyrin ring, and indeed it did. He confirmed the presence of whole blood with these 12 tests, and there's more data out there. There was high iron in blood areas. And this was demonstrated by X-ray fluorescence. It has blood as indicative of the reflection spectra, photometric transmission spectra identified it as blood, chemical generation of characteristic porphyrin fluorescence, the porphyrin ring, it's blood, positive hemochromogen tests. I'm a physicist, I'm sorry. I don't know what that is, but hemo has something to do with blood, right, you know? Positive cyanmethaglobin tests. All of this is talked about, to some degree at least, in Heller's book. There's also some papers that Al Adler wrote that are very informative. All of these things indicate that it's blood. Many of them demonstrate not only is it blood, but it's at least primate blood. And then some data that was taken by European scientists, they ran a whole spectrum, they got more blood. These tests were all done on microscopic samples captured by the adhesive tape technique. So these are done on micro samples, tiny samples. And it was the guys in Italy had discovered the blood was AB, typed AB. They don't know there's positive or negative, it's typed AB. Here's some examples of Evans micrographs. Mark Evans, here's the small. Now one of the things that's interesting is the image, let's see, here's a rather high, 64 times magnification of an image fiber. Notice that the fiber, the image color is very slightly yellowish, and here's clear cloth. So this is image, this is clear cloth. Not a lot of difference. Certainly no evidence of anything laid on top, nothing cementing fibers together. But blood, on the other hand, is quite different. It varies a lot in intensity. If you look at it closely, you see that it sticks the fibers together. There's all kinds of things on the shroud, even a little bit of wax. So how did wax get on the shroud? I'm a big proponent of the idea that the shroud has been used in the past in some kind of liturgical ceremonies, and that therefore there were probably candles on top of the shroud, lighting the shroud, and occasionally somebody's moving the candle, a drop of wax fell on the shroud. And I mentioned last time the burn holes that I personally think probably came from burning incense that accidentally got dumped on the shroud. But I can't prove that. Yes?
Ray, I wasn't here last week, so I'm not sure if you covered this, but is it believed that the shroud was brought to Europe, brought to Italy by Crusaders?
Well, it was brought to France
France?
by Crusaders. That's next week.
Oh, okay.
You're trying to steal my thunder. Yes, Geoffrey de Charny, who was the first European to own the shroud, and our knowledge of the shroud goes back to Geoffrey de Charny, roughly somewhere between 1343 and 1355, probably. Geoffrey de Charny died at the Battle of Poitiers, saving the life of the King of France. He was an honorable knight. He interposed himself between the king and a person who was trying to stab the king with a spear. He died as a result in 56, 1356.
So is that the first time there's documentation of this cloth?
The what?
Is that the first time that there's documentation of this cloth, of the shroud?
You're talking about what documentation?
Well, you mentioned Geoffrey de Charny.
The C-14 test, you mean, or?
No. The medieval.
Well, there's not
Crusader.
really very much documentation. All the documentation is sort of hearsay here and that. There's a lot of documentation about who owned the shroud and who moved it from place to place. And that's mostly occasions, events, times when the shroud was exhibited. It was in the ownership of Geoffrey de Charny. We're going to talk about all this next week in a lot of detail, but it was in the ownership of Geoffrey de Charny in Europe until basically his granddaughter, Margaret, was childless. And the family wanted to preserve the shroud, and they gave it. I don't know if they gave it, but I think she got a castle or two out of the deal. But it was transitioned to the Duke of Savoy at the time, who subsequently, the Savoy line became the kings of Italy. So that's the timeline all the way to the current time. In 1983, Umberto, who was the guy whose wedding was celebrated by the 1931 pictures, Umberto ceded it to the Catholic Church in 1983. I'm not sure that was wise, but since we're out of crowned heads of Europe, it's not clear who do you give it to, something like this, to ensure that it'll be preserved and taken care of. I guess the church was about as good a candidate as any. So here's some of the micrographs. There's a couple of maps here. Barry Schwartz, this is a document that Barry Schwartz put together to indicate the sampling sites of all the various photographs and items that were, and tape samples as well, that were taken of the shroud. Now, there's a fellow named Gilbert Lavoie, and Gilbert's an interesting guy. He got interested in the shroud by reading a 1962 book, not 62, the book A Doctor at Calvary by Pierre Barbet, who was the doctor that came up with the wrist wound stories. And he got fascinated, he's a medical doctor himself, and he got very fascinated by the blood stains. And one of the things is the blood appears to be in the hair here. There's blood here, here. And one of the things Lavoie did is he took a cloth and he laid an image of the shroud over it. He cut holes out of wherever there was a blood stain, he cut a hole out along the profile of the blood stain. And he got a volunteer to lie down, and he laid the cloth on the volunteer's face, and then he transferred marks through the holes. And the interesting thing about the marks is they kind of they appear quite natural as blood wounds, as wounds on the face of the man. And yet in the image, they're out in the hair. Now, one of the things that Alan Adler discovered was that the blood went on before the image went on the cloth. How did he discover that? Well, he had all these little tiny threads. They're not even threads, they're fibers from the surface of the threads from the sticky tape samples, and he took some of the ones that were covered with blood when he was collecting his data to do the blood work, and he washed the blood off. And everyone, I mean, he didn't wash it off, he put a reagent on the blood which resulted in the blood going off into a solution that he was using for testing. And what remained behind was a perfectly white fiber. No image fiber was found underneath the blood. And he had lots of fibers. I mean, not lots and thousands, but, you know, hundreds. And he did this a number of times, and in every case, there was no image under the blood. And he concluded from that that the blood must have gone on the cloth before the image went on the cloth. Well, that's interesting, especially if you're trying to claim that the thing was done by an artist. Because what artist would put the blood on first? That'd be a pretty good trick. Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, this work by Lavoie shows that the blood probably emerged from wounds that were on the face. And what does that mean? It means between the time that the blood went on the cloth and the image went on the cloth was disturbed. Two different events, the blood and the image. What would have caused the cloth to have been disturbed? Well, the bottom line is we really don't know. There's this picture that some artist sometime has of two angels holding the shroud above the body of Christ. So, you know, so it was an angel photograph maybe, but I think that's probably a little speculative. Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't the Bible have the women coming and putting spices on the body? Would they have?
Well, but they came, they didn't find the body, remember. There was no body when they showed up.
Initially.
See, so well they
at first.
Well, what we know, they were coming Sunday morning to anoint the body, and they found an empty tomb instead.
No, but I'm saying when they put him initially in the tomb, would they have put?
When the what?
When they first put him in the tomb, would they have put spices on the body then?
Well, they might have at that time. You got to remember, Christ died about 3 in the afternoon. Sunset was about 6. You had to be in and out of the way by sunset. So what had to happen in the 3-hour interval is somebody had to go to Pontius Pilate and say, we want to take the body. And Pontius Pilate said, oh, is he dead? And then they sent somebody to the body and they stabbed him with a spear. Meanwhile, somebody had to go find a shroud because it says that the shroud was bought. By the way, that's an interesting question. Where do you find a shroud the day before a high holy day in Jerusalem that's 14 feet long and a fine 3-in-1 twill? Which is normally a kind of material used to make garments.
Didn't it come from Joseph?
Make burial shrouds. That's a very interesting question. Not only that, but they've rounded up, Nicodemus showed up with 100 pounds of spice. So you're right. Now my theory, and it's pure speculation, forgive me, they took the body to the tomb, they laid the body in the cloth, wrapped him loosely because they knew they were going to be coming back. They didn't want to, you know, go to a lot of trouble, but they may have moistened the cloth or moistened the body to try to kind of clean him up a little bit, because after all, he was pretty much a mess. I mean, if you talk to, look at the doctors and the forensics, he would have been totally covered with blood. Most of it, much of it dried. And then Nicodemus shows up with 100 pounds of spice. Now, I don't know how they transported spice. I've seen spices wrapped in bricks, in like palm leaves, things like that. But 100 pounds of spice is a lot of spice. And they specifically say that. Now, it wasn't 100 pounds. I wonder what the original Greek is. I don't know, because I don't think they use pounds. But what would you do with the spice? Would you lay it at the bottom of the body? Why did they bring the spice? They brought the spice because they wanted to deter the bodily decomposition, so that when the women came to the tomb after the Sabbath, they would not find a body that was in really advanced stages of putrefaction or something of that nature. So what would they do with the spice? They would pack it next to the body. How do you pack it next to the body when the body's covered with a cloth? Well, you lift up the side of the cloth and you shove the spice in. What would that do? That would tend to flatten the cloth. And then, like if they put spices in next to the head, next to the body, what would it do? It would tend to flatten the cloth. That's just a speculative theory, but it fits sort of the data that we have. We know they brought 100 pounds of spice. And it was a different event, because Nicodemus didn't, I think Nicodemus showed up with the spice at a different time than Joseph of Arimathea showed up with the cloth. So there is a story you could put around this that would make it somewhat plausible that there would be an occasion for disturbing the cloth. Okay. What about this interesting feature? That was a feature that fascinated Lavoie until he realized that what it indicated was that blood had flowed down, pooled on the elbow, and dropped onto the cloth after it pooled enough on the elbow, which actually demonstrates a cloth-wrapped body. Remember, we saw Eric Jumper saying that only one way to wrap the body. So that's a very interesting blood stain. The blood flowed down, pooled behind the elbow, and then dropped off onto the cloth. That's a three-dimensional event. That's a three-dimensional piece of data. Interesting. So what did STURP conclude? Actually, their conclusions are not hugely different from Vignon's. It's not a painting. There's no pigment, no directionality. They did that with Don Lin, who worked for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, used the advanced image processing technology they had there and analyzed the photographs that were taken of the shroud, looking for evidence of directionality, and found none. There was no directionality in the image. The image encodes cloth-to-body distance. We've seen that. The image is ephemeral. What do I mean by ephemeral? The image is on the order of 15 to 30 microns, no thicker. Now, that's not even fair, because the image is ephemeral, macroephemeral and microephemeral. It's macroephemeral in the sense that the image is restricted to individual fibers that make up the threads. The fibers are about half the diameter of a human hair. And when you move a fiber that has image on it aside with a micro manipulator, like, you got it under a microscope and you move it aside, there's no image under it. So the image is one fiber thick. Nobody knows how you can make an image one fiber thick, but another interesting thing is image fibers that were taken off with the adhesive tape, when inspected, two phenomena were observed. One, that the tape sometimes stripped the image off the fiber. So you got what they called ghost images. These ghost images were about 200 nanometers thick. They appeared to be either the primary cell wall of the flax or a very thin impurity layer on the surface of the linen fiber. And interestingly enough, when you looked at the hollow, it was not colored. That suggests that not only is it ephemeral on the level of the thread, individual threads, but the ephemerality of the thread was only on the surface of the thread, about 200 nanometers. Now, I used to work with people that made thin films in laboratories, and we made thin films that were like 200 nanometers. We're talking about really, really thin stuff. So that's amazing. The chromophore, that is the color, is straw yellow, and it has the same color as oxidized linen, and that's the position that was discovered by Adler and John Heller. In their experiments, they were actually able to bleach. They were actually able to bleach image fibers, but they could only do it with incredibly powerful reducing agents. Most chemical bleaches wouldn't come close to touching the color of the shroud. They had to use something called diamine. And if you look diamine up, the first thing you'll notice is they warn you not to mess with it, because it is a very, very powerful reducing agent. And that was the only reducing agent that John Heller and Alan Adler were able to find that could bleach the image fibers. There are fluorescent halos around the blood because serum exuded from a blood clot is fluorescent. And Vern Miller took imagers in fluorescent light and was able to show that many of the bloods, and the ones on the wrist, for example, some of the ones on certainly the bigger blood clots, all showed fluorescent halos from serum exuded from the blood. I mentioned the blood went on before the image. The blood's human blood. There's been some attempt to DNA test, but human blood does not have DNA, so I'm skeptical myself about any of the DNA testing, simply because the shroud's been exposed to so many different people over the years that even if you had DNA, you wouldn't know whether it was from the man of the shroud. There's also calcium, strontium, and iron almost uniformly present in the shroud. And that points to a process of manufacture called retting. Retting is done when you take the flax and you put it in like a stream, and you let the outer husks of the flax rot off, and then you get the fibers that are then spun into thread. The image is medically accurate. Both venous and arterial blood flows are accurate, and that's a little surprising if it was a fake. Because even the discovery of the operation of the heart had not taken place in this time frame. The distortions that are present are consistent with a cloth-wrapped body. We have the drop of blood, for example. Forensic medical examiners have no trouble interpreting the image as a real person. The wounds are consistent with Roman instruments and finally, I am a skeptic about some of these faint images, but the flower images, there's a lot of testimony that claims there are flower images. I'm more skeptical about the coins, but the flower images, there's some very authoritative people who claim to see lots of little flower images on the shroud. The problem I have is, when would anybody have had an opportunity to put flowers on the shroud in the original setting? And I would say no chance. No chance in the original setting. They had a couple of hours to get Jesus buried before the beginning of the holiday, the Passover. They didn't have a chance. But the shroud was discovered without a body in it, and was likely venerated and cherished by the original community. and they may very well have laid flowers on it in the course of some form of liturgical practice, which might explain other things that are on the shroud. So that's possible. The shroud image is, oh gee, I'm running short of time and I'm on 50. I should crank up, okay? I'm going to crank up and show you lots of slides, and if you have any questions, unless you want to hang around. I don't know if you might want to get out of here. Some of you have places to go, people to see. Let me go a little further. 1977, before this happened, Harry Gove, who was one of the developers of the accelerator mass spectroscopy thing for carbon dating, wanted to get the shroud carbon dated with his technique and use as much less material. His main interest, though, was the notoriety it would produce and the popularity that would come from doing the dating. And he went in '78 to Turin to try to explore the possibility of developing carbon dating. There was a lot of planning to try to date the shroud because everybody kind of wanted to do it, but there was a lot of infighting and politics involved, and in fact, Gove didn't like the STURP people. Why didn't he like the STURP people? He wrote a book. If you want to know, read this book, and you will discover that Harry Gove is one of the most arrogant people on the face of the planet, except he's dead now, and one ought not to speak ill of the dead. Harry thought that John Jackson wearing a wooden cross during the shroud testing indicated that John must be a religious fanatic. I think we're all in trouble if we ever rate you. You're obviously a religious fanatic, man. So that's if Harry Gove saw you, you know. And so Gove didn't like that, you know. And meanwhile, in '82, Alan Adler and John Heller had a thread that they got from the Reyes sample, and they had it informally tested. And this should have been a red flag. One end of it tested to 200 AD, the other end it tested to somewhere around 1,000 and 1,200 AD. That's pretty funny for one thread. Something's weird. All kinds of politics evolved trying to get the shroud dated. Byzantine complications. William Meacham wrote a book called The Rape of the Shroud. And it's all about the carbon-14 dating. It's an adventure, rollicksome adventure on how not to do science. And but they finally got a chance to do shroud dating, and 3 laboratories got tests. Here's the Reyes sample we saw earlier. Here's the sample that was taken. This part was trimmed off because it was too near some material that clearly was not from the shroud. They cut this into 3 samples originally, Arizona, Zurich, and Oxford, but then they noticed that the Arizona sample was a little too small, so they cut a little bit off the reserve sample to give to Arizona, and then they tested it, and this is what, I love this exclamation point, and one of, the arrogance of the carbon-14 scientists was a little bit beyond belief. You know, they got a bad date for the shroud, if it's authentic, of 1260 to 1390. Well, most people don't understand how carbon dating works, but the exclamation point is not justified. It is an indication of scientific arrogance. I used to have a little click thing, and then when I clicked this, the gal that played the devil in Mel Gibson's movie would come down from up and look at the exclamation point, but I took that out. It was a little over the top. But so what's going on? Well, there's too much carbon-14 in the shroud. On the other hand, this is how much there should have been if it was 2,000 roughly years old, and here's how much there was. So there was too much carbon-14. Now the only question is, why is there too much carbon-14? Well, it almost didn't matter because all hell broke loose. I mean, you know, we've proved the shroud is a fake. One test, I mean, John Jackson went ballistic over this. I mean, he said, look, we've got thousands of tests we've done on the shroud. Everything we've ever done on the shroud suggests it's authentic, and these guys waltz in and take their carbon sample and get one test and claim that they've proved the shroud's a fake. You know, it's a bad data point, certainly, for authenticity. But the first question should be, why? I don't know. And by the way, it had the shroud, they had 3 control samples, linen from 3 other of different ages. And the shroud dated about the same as the cope of St. Louis d'Anjou. But the shroud data was much less consistent between the labs and had a chi-squared statistic of 6.45. That should have been a red flag. And it is a red flag to statisticians, but nobody, these guys were looking for popularity. For publicity, it wouldn't have helped if you said, well, we got an inconsistent result. So there's all kinds of bad things. And everybody's been trying to figure out why the shroud didn't date accurately if it was authentic. And what are some of the problems with the shroud sample site? Well, the first problem with the shroud sample site is it's clearly anomalous. It's anomalous on, here's UV fluorescence, and the site is darker. Here's where the sample was taken. Here's a blue mosaic test, which is spectral data with false color showing that the whole region is anomalous. Here's the sample site. There's all kinds of people coming up with different ideas about why it could be messed up. But the first thing that I saw that was kind of fascinating is Brian Walsh discovered that the dating was systematically wrong, in the sense that the dates from the labs showed a gradient from the edge of the shroud. Now that's strange. That shouldn't be. Later on, a guy named John Morgan took the fluorescent, the UV fluorescent image, and he discovered that the dating, that in the fluorescent intensity, it was much worse than this that just showed an R squared of 0.49, which is about a 70% correlation. This showed an R squared of 0.9986. Now that's statistical for deterministic. You could predict the darkness of the cloth by how far it was in, and that mapped exactly to the dating they got. There's something seriously wrong with the shroud sample that was taken. Now why? Well, nobody knows. But 2 young folks, fairly young, Sue Benford and Joe Marino, they came up with a theory that's kind of interesting called French invisible reweaving. They believed that in that region, a sample had been taken as a relic to be sent to some nunnery. At least that's one of the theories about why a sample was taken. And that the area was rewoven by French weavers using contemporary 16th century materials. And so when they took the sample was made up of a combination of real shroud and invisibly rewoven shroud, which taken in combination produced the erroneous date. Is this the real answer? Nobody knows. Some people say it's plausible, some people say it's not. Here's Ray Rogers, and I think we're kind of running out of data time because we're already 8 minutes over the end time, so maybe we'll touch on some of this stuff next week.